Are you guys able to see me and hear me?
Yes, Dr. Bukhari.
Thank you.
We formally start our session, our third and final session of the conference uh, about Israeli diplomatic outreach to the Gulf countries, changing political calculus of the Muslim world. And the theme of this session is the effect of prevailing Arab-Israeli peace process on the Muslim world. We are lucky to have uh, scholars from the United States and Pakistan in this session, and we had participants from Tunisia, Tunisia, Turkey, uh, in our other sessions, as well as scholars from Pakistan. The third session is important, as I said, that it is about the impact of prevailing Arab-Israeli process, peace process on the Muslim world, whether it will have an impact on the peace process, this new venture, that or the new development that has taken place in the region. So the first signs of this approachment are still emerging with the repeal of Emirates law concerning the boycott of oil and the first commercial flight that linked two countries at the end of August. Now Bahrain, and we have heard that Bahrain has already announced of having for recognizing of Israel and start diplomatic relations with Israel. Oman is believed to follow the suit. They have Bahrain has announced an historical agreement to normalize its relations with Israel. Many observers expect that other Gulf cooperation countries, monarchies, would follow the footstep of these countries, Gulf countries. And US, as always, uh, a supporter of Israel, has initiated these moves and believe, specifically President Trump, he believes that this development will bring about peace in the Middle East. And same feelings and sentiments have been expressed by the leadership in the US and other Western countries. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo during Middle East tour in the late August, which took in Israel, Sudan, Bahrain, and United Arab Emirates. He was he even said that it was a very optimistic move and saw the Arab countries that the Arab countries would follow the Emirates. Now, the question is, and that was asked in the previous sessions, that whether Saudi Arabia would recognize Israel, or there are certain channels which are, saying that uh, Saudi Arabia has diplomatic relations with Israel, but it is not openly expressing or acknowledging this fact or otherwise. So the Gulf is believed to be led by Saudi Arabia, and Gulf states are seeking to normalize their relations with Israel at some point of time. And this agreement is an open secret. They are all involved to varying degrees, because there can be no single player when it comes to such a sensitive issue. So it is believed that Riyadh is in cahoots with Abu Dhabi and other Gulf countries on the issue. Apart coordinated strategic change of direction taken at the expense of Palestinian. It has been. May I may I request may I request the audience to mute their mics, please? So it is believed that Israel is cautious of regional countries, specifically of Turkey and Iran, ambitions in the Mediterranean and the Gulf monarchies, financed by petro-dominance, are worried about the regional neo-Ottoman pretensions of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Palestinian cause has become secondary in the eyes of petro-monarchies obsessed by Shiite Iranian rival. This rapprochement is in fact mainly based on their common animosity with Israel towards Iran. So this is what is a perception or is believed in different parts and different quarters of the Muslim world. Our participants for today's third and last session are Professor Dr. Muqtadir Khan, Professor Dr. Kamran Bukhari, Brigadier Akhtar Rawaz Janjua, and Dr. Kamrul Huda. First of all, I would request Professor Dr. Muqtadir Khan, but before offering him the forum, I would like to introduce him. He has done his PhD from Georgetown University in 2000, and then he joined the department in 2005. His areas of interest are politics of Middle East and South Asia, political Islam, Islamic political thought, Islam in America, American foreign policy in the Muslim world, and good governance. Professor Khan combines academic and policy orientation in his teaching philosophy and in his research. He was the founding director of the Islamic Studies program at the University of Delaware from 2007 till 2010. He was a fellow and non-resident senior fellow of Brookings Institution from 2003 till 2008. From 2017 till 19, he served as the academic director of the State Department's National Security Institute. And from 2019 till 2021, he is serving as the academic director of State Department's American Foreign Policy Institute. His latest book, Islam and Good Governance, has received the 2019 Excellence in Scholarship Award from AFMI and has been listed as one of the best all-time books in political philosophy by the non-fiction book portal. Over to you, Professor Muqtadir Khan. Sir, are you with us?
Muqtadir, you're muted.
Please unmute your mic, sir.
Oh, okay. Assalamu alaikum to all of you, and thank you, Minas, for such a generous introduction. I was wondering if you could pull up my PowerPoint presentation so I could use that. I don't know how to share on this. This is the first time I'm using Google Meet. Are we pulling it up? If it is not possible, then I can, oh, there it is. All right. So there is, I slightly changed my topic from what's in the program. I want to call it the Gulf between Palestine and Paradise. And the pun obviously on the Gulf is intended. If you go to the next slide, I think I can probably do it from here. I can't. So what I wanted to point out is that the drivers of geopolitics in the Middle East are changing since 1990 to 2016. from 1990 to 2016 was that the East-West polarity that existed during the Cold War was now replaced by an Arab-Israeli polarity. So there were lots of the geopolitics of the Middle East. One of the major drivers was the conflict between Arab-Israeli polarity, which was to some extent modified by the peace treaty with Jordan in 1994. But the Arab countries were motivated by a fear of Israeli expansion, which you saw from 1948 to 1973. Israel really expanded its territory at the expense of Arab countries. So one of the driving forces for Arab foreign policies and grand strategies in that region was the fear of Israeli expansion. And the United States, as an honest broker, entered the Middle East in a new role after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Before the 1989, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was some major force that could balance U.S. influence in the region. But in the absence of the Soviet Union, the United States, as a sole superpower and as an honest broker, essentially intervened in the region and became an interventionist power that essentially tried to preserve two interests. One is maintain the order that existed in the Middle East. Number two, it protected Israel's expansionism, both in the United Nations and on the ground. Can I still stay back in the previous slide? And it also, and the United States was also concerned with two of the new threats that emerged after 1991, the rise of political Islam, Ikhwan al-Muslimin per se. So it was partnering with regional regimes in trying to contain the expansion of political Islam. It had seen what political Islam did to Iran in 1979. It did not wish to see the same experiment repeated in the Arab world. And it also was fighting the jihadis, especially after the 9/11 attacks. The new geopolitics of the Middle East, and especially now culminating with the normalization of Arab-Israeli relations, has seen a lot of the fundamental drivers. Can we stay on this slide? Yes, sister. Thank you. So the first shift that I see in the current region is the polarity that was between Arab-Israel that was driving the Middle East politics is now different. It is an Arab versus Ajam polarity. So this is about Arabs versus non-Arabs in the Middle East. And by non-Arabs, I do not mean Israel. I'm looking at Iran and Turkey. So the main driving force now seems to be between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf allies versus Iran and Turkey. I think Arabs have realized that Israeli power is so beyond Arab capabilities that any potential conflict of the Arab world with Israel is out of the question. It's unthinkable. Israel is a nuclear power and its economy is very vibrant. It has its own technology. Arabs buy foreign technology and you can't fight on foreign technology alone. So the idea of Arabs overwhelming Israel militarily or even threatening Israel militarily does not exist. But something else has also happened. And one of the key things is that the Arabs do not fear further territorial expansion of Israel. So they do not think that Israel is going to take land from Jordan or Saudi Arabia or Egypt or others. Israeli expansion is now limited to the territory it already controls, in the sense that it is essentially making it impossible for West Bank to become an independent state. So its imperialism and expansionism is within the borders that it already controls. And because it does not threaten the territories of other Arab countries, they do not see Israel as a major threat to their security or their interests, unlike Iran and Turkey, which are playing more and more role outside their borders. Arab state is a failing region. It is full of failed states. If you look at Iraq, if you look at Syria, if you look at Libya, if you look at Yemen, I mean, on four corners of the Arab states, somebody has turned their mic on, so I can't hear. On the four corners of the Arab world, you can see that there are failed states: Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen. And so the region is literally collapsing, and it is struggling to essentially survive. Can we go to the next slide? So the next slide. So one of the major drivers of the region has always been the presence of the United States. But if you see especially since 2016, the United States is gradually withdrawing from the region. If it hadn't been for escalation of U.S. military presence in Syria and Afghanistan, the U.S. is unilaterally withdrawn 1/3 of its forces from the Middle East. And this is an important because it creates a power vacuum. In the past, the US would never do that because it would give Soviet Union more room to operate. And as you will see from the next slide, even though the US is creating a power vacuum by showing less interest in having a military presence in the Middle East, Russia's token presence, which is essentially in Syria, one spot in Iraq and Iran. And so Russia's token presence does not to that extent threaten the US interest in the region at the moment. And so there is this power vacuum that has been created by United States leading from behind policy and Donald Trump's absolute disinterest in managing the region. So what that has done is it has given the mid-range powers of Iran and Turkey an opportunity to assert and expand their influence in the region. So if you look at the next slide, this is Turkey's expansion in the region. So you can see Turkey is everywhere. It seems at least 6 to 7 different places in the Middle East. Turkey now has troops on the ground in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya. Also in Qatar, it practically has a military base there. And there are also lots of, I couldn't confirm them myself, but clearly that the Turks have a presence even in Africa, especially in Eritrea and Somalia area. So the Turkish military presence, I mean, you see a new emerging imperial Turkey, something that for the Arab world would be nightmarish given the past history of the Ottoman Empire. The next slide, sister, with respect to Iran. So this is Iranian military presence. Iran's imperialism is a new kind of imperialism. It's imperialism by proxies. So if you notice, it has proxies in nearly all around. If you're Saudi Arabia, you will be so paranoid by looking at this map because you feel as if Iranian proxies are completely surrounding you. They are everywhere, all around you, north, south, east, west. And these are the threats. If you notice, I cannot give you a map like this of Israeli military presence. Israeli military presence is kind of unnecessary given US military presence in the region, but it does not threaten the Arab world territorially the way Iranian and Turkish threats, military presence continues to threaten. And if you notice, Israel has never really attacked Saudi Arabia, the main Arab leader in that sense, but Iran has recently actually dared to attack Saudi Arabia in spite of all the threats from the United States. So this paranoia of Iran, which is exaggerated to some extent and real in many ways, is essentially altering the polarity in the Middle East. It's changing the international relations and the dynamics between the way these countries do. And it will also impact countries in the region, other countries who are not involved in the geopolitical contest between these countries, like Pakistan, like Malaysia and Indonesia. They will be forced ultimately to take sides in one way or the other. I expect Oman to be the next country for normalization, followed by Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is hesitant at the moment. And I don't know whether Saudis still hope to get some leverage out of Israel, because the concessions that are being made to Israel is without any concessions on Israel's part. And the last slide that I have of Palestine is, can we go to the last slide? The slide after this. The last slide shows that there is territorially impossible to talk of a Palestinian state, a contiguous Palestinian state. It is like a Bantustan. And what is clear is that while the Palestinians may continue to struggle for whatever kind of autonomy, look, if you look at it, it's impossible to create an independent Palestinian state without forcing Israel to withdraw from many parts of the West Bank, and also providing a land bridge to Gaza. And I don't see that happening anywhere in the near future. So the Palestinians will have to find a way to adjust to this new reality. They may pursue with their ambitions for an independent state, but you can now realize that what is happening now is that the Palestinians are being reduced to the status of the Kurds. So the situation that the Kurds have experienced for the last 20 to 30 years in the Middle East, nobody really cares about them except themselves, even though they continue to threaten at least 4 states in that region. The Palestinians will probably also become like that. There is a fatigue for the Palestinian cause. across the Arab world, and I think that as an important driver of geopolitics in the Middle East, the desire to create a Palestinian state does not have the same value that it had in the past. I also think that to some extent, the Arab states have realized that whatever legitimacy they could draw in the past by doing lip service with regards to the Palestinian cause, that is not valuable anymore. There have become bigger causes, the sectarianism between the Shias and the Sunnis, particularly in Iraq, and also the regional contest within the countries has become far more important. Plus, there is also this enduring issue of failure of governance in the Middle East, the inability of these states to govern themselves well. I mean, places like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates look really, really good because of the surplus of cash that is available, which now may not be available to Saudi Arabia at least. Because of the surplus of wealth, they are able to hide the fact that they are really very badly governed states. And I have a feeling that they are beginning to realize the limits of petro-diplomacy and are trying their best to ensure two things: not only ensure their territorial integrity as states, but also to ensure the character of their existing regimes and prolong these regimes, these monarchies, these emirates for as long as they can, at least into the next generation. So I will stop with that, and I'll be happy to answer questions when we have a Q&A session. Thank you.
Dr. Minhas, please unmute your mic.
Thank you, Professor Muqtadir Khan. Our next speaker is Dr. Kamran Bukhari. He's Director of Analytical Development at the Center for Global Policy. Dr. Bukhari is also a national security and foreign policy specialist at University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute. Dr. Bukhari has also served as the Central Asia Studies Course Coordinator at the US Department of State's Foreign Service Institute from 2019 to 2020. He was a fellow with the program on extremism at George Washington University from 2016 till 2018. He has also been a senior consultant with the World Bank since 2009. He has 15 years of experience in private sector intelligence space, during which he provided intellectual leadership in the publishing of cutting-edge geopolitical analysis and forecast. Over to you, Dr. Kamran Bukhari. Dr. Kamran,
can everybody hear me? Thank you. Thank you, Professor Khan, for that generous introduction. My topic is looking at the strategic threat environment from an Israeli perspective. I'm going to do empathetic analysis, which means that I'm going to put myself in the shoes of the state of Israel and look at the region from its eyes and how it sees everything going on. I think it's very important that anybody studying the region, especially a region like the Middle East, where there are multiple actors in a very, very small battle space, that you need to be able to do empathetic analysis for every single actor. Dr. Khan just recently highlighted, Iran, Turkey, and the Arab states. And so you have a good idea of what this environment, what this crowded environment looks like. And of course, don't forget the non-state actors that operate there as well, that have actors like Hezbollah, ISIS, the various offshoots of Al-Qaeda, and other non-state actors that are not jihadist or Islamist necessarily. So I'm just going to try and put up a map here. If you can just give me 1 second, and I'll... Okay. Can everybody see this map of Israel? Okay, so let's look at a bit about history, and I want to start with 1978. 1978 is the year when the largest and most significant Arab state, Egypt, signed a peace treaty called the Camp David Accords with Israel, sponsored by the Carter administration. And at that was a turning point in Israel's strategic environment. From 1948, the inception of Israel, until 1978, a solid 30-year period was marked by war, several wars: the 1948 war, the 1956 war, the 67, and the 1973 war. I won't go into the details of that, but suffice to say that Israel spent the bulk of its time fighting for its survival, because it is surrounded by, from its perspective, hostile enemies that were out to destroy it. Now, obviously, Israel engaged in a lot of preemptive action, particularly the 1967 war, in which it did a preemptive strike against all three of its major neighbors, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. But until 1978, the Israeli strategic environment was that we need to be prepared for war, and our enemies are far larger than us in terms of population, in terms of area, resources. Yes, we have technology, we have US support, but we are a small population, and the state of Israel has very little strategic depth. If you look at Israel, it's very narrow. It runs north-south, and that's very significant, because the heartland of Israel, if you can see on the map, is the Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem corridor. That is where the bulk of the Israeli population lives, and it's not very far from either Lebanon, Syria, or Jordan, perhaps a bit far from Egypt, but nonetheless, it's still very vulnerable. What the 1978 peace treaty with Egypt did was essentially relieve Israel of the need to basically compete with the largest Arab state in the region. And all it had to do was now worry about other actors. And I'll get into those other actors here in a bit. But you have to, I can't emphasize enough how 1978 was a turning point for Israel, because it no longer had to field such a large military force on its southern flank, and therefore it gained a lot of reprieve, and it gained a lot of, if you will, bandwidth to deal with other threats. Now, the other threats are secondary if you look at it, Egypt being the largest state, and if you look at the history of the wars between the Arab states and the Israelis, Egypt was the lead. In fact, in the 1978 peace treaty was made possible by the fact that Israel almost lost the 1973 war. At one point, the Egyptians were gaining on them. And so there was a reality, and some scholars have argued that the Sadat government at the time, the government of former President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, essentially...
Dr. Bukhari, may I interrupt you, please?
Sure.
The map is actually not visible to the audience.
The map is not visible. Okay. Can we do without the map?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop presenting then here. Sorry about that, technical glitches. Okay, so some scholars have argued that President Sadat launched the 1973 war with Israel in order to negotiate from a position of relative strength. By 1973, the Egyptians realized that there is no military solution, and Israel was a power to contend with. It's a reality. It's not going anywhere. And so the fanciful ideas that, we will take, all of historic Palestine, it's only a matter of time, that essentially that idea was abandoned, and the war was primarily launched in order to be able to balance the terms of engagement on the negotiating table, and which is why the next 5 years were spent doing back channeling, sponsored by the Americans, to have a negotiated settlement between the Israelis and the Arabs. Now, the Israelis and the Egyptians. Now, until this situation lasted until about 2011, which is the year of the Arab Spring, and I'll get to that here in a moment. But it's important to note that during this time, the Israelis were able to go in and neutralize the threat of the PLO in the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, because they were no longer worried about Egypt. They did not have to worry about the southern flank. I would also want to point out that that Jordan, although Jordan's formal peace treaty took place in 1994 with Israel, but Jordan and Israel have had very, very close, behind-the-scenes, quiet relationships going back to the inception of Israel and actually essentially the 50s, where there was an understanding between the Jordanians and the Israelis that, there's quiet cooperation. And the idea was, from an Israeli perspective, is to how to manage Jordan. So if you're Israel, and you can be attacked from the north, you can be attacked from the south, and you can be attacked from the east, that is a very, very impossible situation. So you have to come into arrangements. A state like that, and it doesn't matter, you can pick up any geography of the world. If you're in a situation like that, I mean, most of people attending are from Pakistan. The analogy is, you cannot deal with India if Afghanistan is unsecure, and imagine if there was a hostile China as well. So there is no way it's an impossible situation, militarily, strategically speaking. So from the Israeli perspective, having those quiet relationships to manage to keep Jordan from engaging heavily into combat with the Israeli state was part of the strategy until about 2011. Now, during this time period, you also have the Israeli-Palestinian accords called the Oslo Accords in 1993, brokered by the Clinton administration. Now, what that did was that also took off the PLO as a major threat to the Israelis. But what has happened since 1993 on the Palestinian front is that the Palestinians became increasingly divided. And there's a long history from 1993 to 1994, the formation of the Palestinian National Authority, a sort of proto-state that has existed since then and has become kind of defunct because it's lost power, weakness, and of course the intra-Palestinian rivalry between Hamas, which is headquartered in the Gaza Strip. If you look, again, I'm sorry we can't see the map, but if you look at a map of Israel, Palestinian territories are divided. Again, the Pakistani analogy is West Pakistan and East Pakistan, and India in between. So from an Israeli point of view, this has its benefits, but it also has its disadvantages, where you're facing Palestinians on two fronts. Again, lack of strategic depth means there are two fronts and you have to deal with them. So in many ways, the divide between within the Palestinians, between the Islamist Hamas movement and the secular Fatah movement, which dominated the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Palestinian Authority, was very, very beneficial, helped the Israeli strategic position. By the late 2000s, I would say, Israel was in a very, very comfortable spot. Why? Because it went through a series of terrorism that, from the late 90s all the way to 2004 or 5 on the part of Hamas and other factions that opposed the peace with the Israelis. And the Israelis by 2004 were able to essentially crack down efficiently on all forms of terrorism. Hamas's military back was broken, which is why we see in 2006 Hamas coming in and saying we're going to participate in Palestinian legislative elections. And in the 2006 elections, they actually won a majority of seats. I think they, out of about 90 or 100 some seats, they had 72. So you can see the extent to which Hamas was popular and joined the mainstream. Now, because of that internal feud within the Palestinians, the Hamas, first of all, a Hamas-led government was not acceptable because Hamas is considered as a terrorist organization by the United States government, European states, as well as Israel and many Arab states. So Hamas had a difficulty in forming a government on its own. It needed to go back to Fatah, its rival, and try to come up with a coalition government. By 2007, within a year, everything falls apart because the coalition government is not working, and we have a new reality emerging of two Palestines. What do I mean by that? You had Hamas forcibly expel Fatah from the Gaza Strip, and then Fatah retaliated by arresting everybody from Hamas in the West Bank, and essentially you had two Palestinian territories, statelets, if you will, run by two rival organizations. From an Israeli strategic point of view, this is fine because it can be managed. You're not dealing with one, and not only do you deal with two areas, you're dealing with two areas dominated by two different factions, and there's a different cadence and a different management style. And in the meantime, the West Bank saw an increase of Jewish settlements, which was also part of the security architecture of Israel, whereby Jewish settlers from Israel moved into the West Bank and took over large parts of the territory, built towns, and now we have massive settlements. Again, I wish I had a map to show you the settlements. Actually, if you have time and you're interested, you can go on Google and you can find maps that show you the expansion of settlements from the 1990s onwards. Inside, or actually, you can go back as far as 1967. So we now come to 2011. 2011 is another very, very dramatic moment in the strategic environment of Israel. But before I get into that, I also want to point out that in 2006, there was a war with Hezbollah, a limited 30-day war that essentially forced the Israelis into a very difficult position. The Israelis were not able to impose defeat on Hezbollah as they had on the PLO back in the 80s. And this created a new threat. By now, Iran has really beefed up Hezbollah as a paramilitary threat to Israel. Hezbollah is also beholden to Syria prior to 2011, but there is an understanding with the Syrians that, look, we don't want to fight you. We recognize your influence and your control in Lebanon. You don't bother us, we don't bother you. And there was an unwritten sort of an agreement. And there were also efforts in the 2000s to have a potential peace treaty with Syria as well, which did not go too far because the Syrians demanded the return of their territory called the Golan Heights, which is on the border between Syria and northeastern Israel. And so that did not allow the peace treaty to move forward. And there wasn't much benefit from the perspective of Damascus in rushing for a peace treaty without the return of the Golan Heights. So this is the strategic picture on the eve of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring really shakes up the entire architecture of the region in that autocratic meltdown takes place. Some regimes are overthrown, like Libya and Yemen. Some regimes are shaken very badly, like the Egyptian government. Some regimes face civil war, like Syria. And so this is a new strategic environment for Israel since 2011. And Israel has had to sort of reinvent itself in terms of its modus operandi, in terms of how it's going to deal with a reality where Arab states are no longer in control of their territory. the assumption until then was that the Arab states, there was a central entity in each state that held the decision-making power over when to wage war against Israel. Even in the case of Hezbollah, Hezbollah is a non-state actor, but it would not do anything without the permission of Iran and or Syria. And therefore, this was the understanding that, okay, as long as there are states in the Arab world that control their territory, can impose their writ on their area, and have a monopoly over violence, then we don't have to worry about non-state actors. All of that is gone after the Arab Spring. Syria is a mess. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of factions, at least at the height of the civil war, that were opposed to the Syrian regime. The Syrian regime lost half of the control of half of the country. It now is sort of hunkered down in the western half of the country, and the east is either in Kurdish control or used to be in control of ISIS. Those areas are in limbo. There's a contestation over who controls those areas. But by and large, the Syrian regime has been weakened. Hezbollah has grown since the 2011 uprisings, because now it's no longer just a Lebanese actor. It is actually a core support base for the Syrian regime. So things have flipped. There was a time when the Syrian regime nurtured Hezbollah. Now we're in a situation where Hezbollah's support is needed by the Syrian regime. Likewise, the Egyptian government is no longer that strong, even though it has survived. The military-dominated state was able to get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood government in 2013 and consolidate itself, but it's very fragile. The economy isn't doing well. Population is out of control. We're talking about 110 million people in Egypt, and all of them, or most all of them, live along the Nile River. So you can imagine how difficult of a political economy, and how difficult it is to have a viable political economy with a country that has very few resources, does not have energy, has some natural gas, but it's nothing compared to what Qatar has and the other Persian Gulf Arab states in terms of the ability to export energy and raise revenue. In fact, Egypt is heavily dependent on the Gulf states to pay its bills. So this is a new environment that the Egyptians are in. The Israelis are looking at. They're looking at with great trepidation as to what's going to happen in the south. They're also looking at a Jordan really squeezed by 680,000 refugees from Syria. They're all almost, some estimates say that as many as half of all Jordanians are actually of Palestinian origin. And so there's that. There are Iraqi refugees from 1991 war and the 2003 war, and now we have Syrian refugees. There's a lot of strain and stress on the Jordanian monarchy, and this is a big worry for the Israelis, that if the Jordanian monarchy were to weaken, what would their eastern flank look like? And of course, Hezbollah is active, and most recently, and this is my final point, is that because of heavy Iranian involvement, Dr. Khan mentioned that its strategy of expanding its tentacles geopolitically relies on proxies. And so Syria right now is the biggest proxy battle space, or at least the most important battle space from the Iranian perspective. That is why you not only have lots of Shiite militias, some say as many as 100,000 fighters inside Syria, supporting the regime, fighting ISIS, fighting the Sunni factions, and trying to help the Syrian military, which has been gutted through because of attrition over the last 8 years of war. So the Iranian presence is now the new strategic threat. So if Iranian military forces, and there are several thousand advisors and commanders at any given time from Iran, and this is why you see the Israelis speaking with the Russians to say, okay, we need a buffer zone, and there shouldn't be any Iranian president within 50 miles of the Syrian-Iranian border, the Syrian-Israeli border, and if they do come in, we'll do airstrikes. And this is why you hear reports of very frequently, the Israelis conducting preemptive airstrikes inside Syria, in Lebanon, and now also in Iraq as well, on Iranian positions or positions held by pro-Iranian militiamen. So this is the overall strategic threat environment of Israel that Israel is operating in, and this basically battle space. This picture shapes its security perspective and basically informs every decision that it is making, whether it's making peace with UAE and Bahrain, whether it's, if you will, maintaining a very tight siege of the Gaza Strip, whether it's in clash with Turkey, whether it's having, back channels with Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. I will stop here and hope to engage you in Q&A. Thank you. You're muted, Professor Khan.
Thank you, Dr. Bukhari. Before inviting our third speaker, I would like to welcome Dr. Kamral Huda. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Now, the third speaker of this session is Brigadier Akhtar Nawaz Janjua, Sitara Imtiaz Military. He is senior member of the advisory board of Center for Global and Strategic Studies and is highly successful professional possessing a wealth of transferable skills in leadership, management, and administrative domains. He carries a vast experience of serving in different capacities of instructional, staff, and executive positions during his more than 4 decades long and meritorious military service in Pakistan and abroad, and now in corporate sector. He's part of analytical research, evaluation, appreciation, decision-making, and supervision processes at the highest level where excellence of execution is the norm. He contributes his influential expertise to regional connectivity in public forums around the globe, engaged in different activities, seminars, conferences in the region. He is a frequent participant and guest speaker at different conferences, roundtable talks, seminars, and interactive sessions from the stage of Center for Global and Strategic Studies, as well as other think tanks and institutions in Pakistan and abroad. He has also represented Center for Global and Strategic Studies and Pakistan at the 12th SCO Forum meetings in Tashkent, Uzbekistan in May 2017, and 14th SCO Forum that was held in Beijing, China in April 2019. Over to you, Brigadier Janjua.
Assalamu alaikum and a very good evening. Thank you very much, Dr. Saiba, for a wonderful introduction, probably rather lengthy. Having heard Dr. Khan and Dr. Bukhari, I really feel that I missed the first 2 sessions. I was engaged elsewhere, so I just came in time to open up for this third session. But the content and the quality which they presented, really, I would like to have all the recording and listen to previous speakers as well. Some wonderful inferences and conclusions by both the honorable speakers, and I appreciate that. I only wish that what Dr. Khan has said, that our Arab brothers have drawn the inference now that Israel is done with the expansion and it's not going to move forward from present borders. So they are very happy, and I only hope that that is the truth, and that happens actually, whereas what one reads and sees that they are looking at things, and they've already reached there probably from Nile to Euphrates, and then on to Khyber, and Medina is not far away from Khyber. But my topic is Pakistan stance, or what Pakistan feels on this new development in the Middle East, where our Arab brothers are one by one in the mold of having peace with Israel, I think one must appreciate the peace process anywhere in the world. Wherever peace happens, one has to actually acknowledge the goodwill behind that. And we acknowledge that. And we have very good relations with Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, and Bahrain, and all those who are going to follow the suit. A lot of working class is there in these countries from Pakistan. So Pakistan's stance I'll come to a little later. I'm sure speakers in the morning session, previous two sessions, must have dilated in great details on the history of Israel and what has been happening since the Balfour Declaration in 1948. And my predecessors here, both of them have from 1948 till 2011 and up till now have covered the things. So I'll not get into that. We don't share any boundaries with Israel. We have no direct conflicts with Israel. Pakistan does not have. The only issue is Palestine and its caged people. And as far as the Jewish people are concerned, well, they have remained stateless, statusless, and voiceless for almost 2,000 years. They were subjected to persecution, discrimination, all sort of segregation in those 2,000 years, and I have all the sympathy with them. Alas, we human beings do not learn anything from our history, our past, and gleefully subject others to what we have weathered. And Israeli or the Jewish people have weathered all that stuff which they are throwing onto the Palestinians for 2,000 years, and it is just about, let's say, a few hundred years that Palestinians have been through this. Zionism. There's a lot of talk of Zionism. It is as old as that Mabad or that worship place on the Mount of Sion, Dawood al-Islam's. But this Zionist movement, which started after that book of Jewish state of Theodor Herzl, has achieved a singular success. And there are points to be taken home by all of us that look how his dream or whatever he outlined has been achieved by strict adherence to the objectives to be achieved, maintenance as in the army jargon we say, and they have actually translated everything which they thought. And I had just written a quote in that book, from that book, and it's such a beautiful quote. I agree to everything except the last two phrases. I have not made any slides, so I'll just quote Mr. Theodor Herzl. He said, "I believe that a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. The Maccabeans will rise again. Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes. The world will be freed by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness," unquote. So before the world will be enriched and freed, everything they have turned into, but world has been divided since their inception as they came into being. And there has been persecution and oppression and wars and everything. So the last two phrases, rest, I think what Mr. Herzl said is absolutely correct. And then also, if one sees the history, they were ready to go to Argentina to have the state of Israel. They were also ready to go to Africa to have the state of Israel. It was not only this Palestinian land where they would come, because this is a holy place for all the three divine religions. But they decided, those people who wanted them to come here, they decided that it should be here where they are right now. And what Dr. Khan said, if they have actually settled down that whatever they have, probably the world will be a better place. But as a military man, I personally feel that that is not the case. That is not the case. The Israel probably is the only country which doesn't believe in any defined borders. It like someone in 1930s and 40s who believed in the race supremacy, they also believe that they are the blessed ones and rest everybody must perish or bow before them. But these are matters of history. But Dr. Khan and Dr. Bukhari said, I'm sure the speakers before that must have given the sides of Turkey and Iran and the other world, because what they said, their ideas coincide and probably present one side of the coin only, not the wholesome picture, but some wonderful inferences. I have learned a lot. As far as Pakistan's stance is concerned on normalization with Israel, as I said, all our brothers in the Middle East are sovereign states. They can make their decision and do whatever they want to. Pakistan should not interfere in anything. But our stance on the state of Israel goes way back from 1948 to 1917, when Mr. Balfour's declaration, the then All India Muslim League had observed that there's a danger for the sanctity of the sacred places and the life and property of the Israeli people. Now, again, in 1940, in the Pakistan resolution and Mentopag, Muslim League did not forget to mention about Israel. And of course, once there was a question of Israel going to United Nations, the founder of Pakistan vehemently opposed that. And he said it should not be accepted. And he hoped that it will not be accepted, but it was accepted. So he had something. And I appreciate in the vision of the great man, the things turned out like that. And I also appreciate the vision of Mr. Ben Gurion, who was the Prime Minister of Israel. Once he had said that we have nothing to fear our neighbors, the Arabs. If we have to fear, then we have to fear this nascent country which just got independence about 9 months before us. Pakistan would like to have good relations with Israel, but there are two identical issues. As the people of Kashmir are suffering at the hands of India, the people of Palestine are suffering, and since long suffering at the hands of Israel. So, Mr. Bukhari talked about the Hamas army and the militia, the Al-Fatah army and the Hezbollah army. Israelis have one of the best armies and technologies at their place. It is just like that a trained army goes on a rampage in a village where people are actually armed with the axes and the hammers. But still, they have some forces there. And I wish that one day they have their country, but my worthy doctors have said that for the time being there is no hope, and they are very practical. They are very practical because, as I said, world forsaken and brothers cheated as Palestinians should not hope for a country in near future. So as well as Pakistan's stance is concerned, in a recent interview, Prime Minister Imran Khan also reiterated what Quaid-e-Azam had said in 1948. So Pakistan has not changed. There has been a talk of Israeli-Pakistani relationship in General Pervez Musharraf's time, when the two foreign ministers met in Turkey, there was a lot of talk. Pakistan is a difficult country, a very difficult country, where rationality probably is routed by the extreme views. On the one side, we have the orthodoxy, and other side, we have the no-holds-barred liberality. They never meet. So whether it's a good thing, we don't agree, and it's a bad thing, we don't condemn that. So probably it would be difficult for any leader, maybe there's some dictator who makes the decision. For a politically elected leader, it would be very difficult in Pakistan to find consensus to have some sort of relationship now or in the near future with Israel. And the reason is that political leadership itself is marred by corruption, incompetence, and indecisiveness, looking here and there for decision making. So probably the situation is going to stay. I believe that if there is normalization of relationship with Israel, probably Israel would find a good market here for Pakistan, in Pakistan. And if Pakistan recognizes Israel, follows the suit of the Arab brothers, then other countries like Iran and Turkey and Malaysia and other Muslim countries might have to think that they should also fall in line. Pakistan, of course, can benefit in the agriculture advancement, which Israelis have the infrastructure and the technology. I don't think so that they'll be too happy to share the military technology with Pakistan. So with them coming in Middle East and just in Oman and UAE and Saudi Arabia, so far they have not recognized them, and Bahrain. I think Israelis had interaction with Pakistanis in United States, in Europe, elsewhere, with probably the intelligentsia, but now they shall have access to the working class as well. And maybe if the relations remain sore, then some sort of danger is also going to be there, because the CPEC is also a bone of contention between China and America, and Pakistan, of course, is the one which has the CPEC running through it up to Gwadar. So if Israel somehow agrees to give the right to live, to exist as human beings to the Palestinians, then Pakistan then should not have any hesitation. But till then, it would be difficult for Pakistan, because then you will have to sacrifice the already sacrificed Kashmiris. Then your stance on Kashmir would go out of the window. So Pakistan is a difficult situation, I personally feel. But as Prime Minister said, I agree with him. That has been Pakistan's stance since 1917. There has been no change. There have been efforts. This point is discussed every day, and probably you have done a wonderful job to actually sensitize the young students of your university and all those who are listening, that we should ponder over all this stuff and what can be done for our own safety, security, and the safety, security of the world. And what Dr. Bukhari has said about the Arabs, the Egypt 1973 and thereafter, actually he's reminded us all about our incompetence, about the inertia which we have served, the love for the ease which we have developed over a period of time. He said surplus cash, and that surplus cash has given us this. I will not get into the spring and who started this spring and how the autumn came to Libya and Yemen and other places on Mr. Mursi. That should be a subject of some other webinar. But I'll just end that. Thank you very much for this wonderful webinar, and I really missed the previous speakers. I would like to listen to all them. And Pakistani stance, of course, is what Prime Minister said in his TV interview. There's no change, and I don't think so that there's going to be any change in the near future, depending upon our own internal situation. As far as the Arabs are concerned, they are sovereign, they have made their decisions, and others will also not ask Pakistan, they'll make their decision. Proxies, again, a different subject, proxies by Iran, Turkey, and other places. I think we can have another webinar. Thank you very much for giving me time, and the way haphazardly I have presented my viewpoint. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for a very comprehensive talk. In fact, you have answered many questions that were asked in our previous two sessions. And one question often asked was whether Pakistan would recognize Israel or not. So you have answered that question, and there are students, scholars among the audience who are joining each session that is going on. So thank you very much for your comprehensive talk. Now I would like to invite Dr. Kabul Huda. He earned his doctorate from UCLA in Islamic Intellectual History and is adhered from Colgate University. He is a senior program officer in Religion and Peacemaking program and a scholar of Islam at the U.S. Institute of Peace. His area of expertise is Islamic theology, intellectual history, ethics, comparative ethics, the language of violence, conflict resolution, and non-violence in contemporary Islam. His new USIP book, The Crescent and Dove, Critical Perspective on Peace and Conflict Resolution in Islam, provides a critical analysis of model of non-violent strategies, peace building efforts, conflict resolution methods in Muslim communities. His research is on comparative Sunni Shia um, interpretations of the social justice, ethics, dialogue, and the ways in which the notion of justice is used and appropriated. And Dr. Huda has examined the production of religious knowledge, the diversity of religious practices, identity, and peacemaking in striving for divine union, spiritual exercises for Sohrawardi Sufis, published by Routledge Curzon. He taught Islamic studies and comparative religion at Boston College, College of Holy Cross, and Brandeis University. I would like to invite Dr. Kamrul Huda as the last speaker of the day. Dr. Kamrul Huda, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. I just wanted to ask if you can hear me.
You're audible, sir.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to your webinar. I know it's been a very productive, very vibrant day full of conversations on this incredibly important subject. And I'm really excited to be here. And I'm really thankful to you to including me. Just to add one note, if it's okay, I know my subject is what should students of international relations expect next on this topic, and I'll expand on that just momentarily. I just wanted to add that for those who are listening, that I did serve in the U.S. State Department for 5.5 years, close to 6 years in the previous administration, and the policy planning and other secretary's office. So in terms of policy making, policy thinking, and the way the U.S. works diplomatically in global affairs, I was very fortunate to have sort of the front row seat there. And then since then, I've been teaching in different departments in Georgetown, and of course, worked with my colleague Kamran Bukhari at the Center for Global Policy, and of course, my great colleague here, Muqtada Khan. Thank you again for everyone for your time, enjoying this whole event, and to you, Professor, for putting this together. What I think my previous couple of speakers have pointed out is, for me, what's not important is the details of each issue, while they're all important in its varieties and its all diversity of thought and possibilities and scenario. What's important is the changing landscape that we're witnessing in our lifetime. And I think this is really important for students of IR and those who actually are studying and writing this. This is just not just a new chapter, but this is what I would call a seismic change for the region. After 70 years of planned, if not concerted efforts of isolation between the Arab states and Israel, concerted efforts of sanctions, of course, 3 major wars, and of course, other skirmishes involvement in each other's countries' domestic politics, domestic economic issues, military issues. We've seen that after 70 years plus in the region, that if you take the realist school of IR, which I belong to, that if it hasn't worked, you must revise your assumptions. You have to revise your hypothesis of IR. One has to revise your possibilities of scenarios. And I think this is what the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and other countries to follow, Chad and et cetera, Sudan, and I think Oman, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and all these others that are planning for the rest of the year to join this coalition to recognize Israel, is not just some haphazard, accidental thought and exercise, but a real realization. And I think this is where the realist school of thought may be playing into this thinking, that one has to think about not just national interest, right, not of UAE or Bahrain, but your regional interest. Now, Israel has been, if you just look at, basically, I'm not a Israeli spokesperson, I'm not a pro-Israeli person or a pro-Omani UAE. I'm just trying to show the international relations of this issue, that students need to see that if 70 plus years of isolation and sanctions and non-diplomatic relations has not helped the basics of international relations. Now, international relations, the basics C's are, cooperation, of course, and basic competition in all aspects of running a nation, economic, social, political, commerce, and so forth. And if all things fail, then we end up in the third C of conflict. What I'm saying is that I think the latest move is an example of a realization that isolation, sanctions, and war is not helping the Palestinians, and is definitely not helping anyone else in those who are sympathetic to the Palestinians. And in fact, it is impacting the national interest of these countries, UAE or Bahrain specifically, the national interest and their regional interest, whatever they may be and whatever they identify. And I don't have the time to go into that, but I think it was spoken. I know Dr. Bukhari spoke very well of sort of the battle space and the issues that Israel and the Arab states pose together, and what are the different fault lines. So what I'm saying is, I think once speaks of the national interest, regional interest, one could see that if they UAE and Bahrain did all the scenario planning and all of the possibilities. And again, this goes with not just one team within the bureaucracy of foreign policy strategists, but it goes with, of course, intelligence, it goes with the army, it goes with number of teams within the bureaucracy to test all of these ideas to see what will happen in any recognition, in any diplomatic recognition, any peace agreement. What are the pluses? What are the minuses? What are the force sides? What do we identify as a hypothesis to move forward that will be advantageous to us and to our alliances? And I think this was the most important that they identified. One is there is a seismic move to say we can gain benefit with this relationship, obviously, and we can gain benefit from our national and regional interest, as well as if the Palestinian issues, of course, is an interest, we can be a voice to represent, if not only represent, but to propose other solutions for a change in their abysmal existence. They do have a Palestinian Authority. They do have a government. They do have, in Gaza they have Hamas, but they are almost dysfunctional in terms of regional politics and national politics. So maybe this is a factor in the calculus, is what I wanted to say, and for Bahrain and the UAE. That's one thing. The national interest is very extremely important, but also the interest of moving forward in regional and international affairs. And I think this is what's interesting. I think what we are missing here in Pakistan and then other places is that we don't really appreciate the advances and the degree of advances that Israel has made in every single sector in society, and of course in national politics and international relations. Whether you talk about healthcare, whether you talk about research in the sciences, we're going through a global pandemic, that excel in these areas. They excel in IT and excel in research in IT. They excel in, of course, army and battle research and military research. They excel in even the humanities and so forth and so forth. I don't need to explain all these details, but if it's not recognized that after 70 years of isolation and sanctions, that in fact it's not working, that they have moved to the degree of advancing so far ahead, then what purpose do your sanctions work? What purpose do your isolation policies do? What purpose does not having a diplomatic relations serve? And because all of these things are in fact isolating yourself outside of this arena. And this is what I think that we need to think. And the point number two is students of IR need to see the balance of power that's being shifted here. Now, some would argue a lot that this is an issue of China, Iran, and Russia, and of course those are major factors in all of this in this recognition of Israel's diplomatic relations with UAE and Bahrain. Yes, of course, when you think about IR, but what's happening is the ability for these nations to really cooperate on different levels, whether it be on medicine or medical research, medical development. It's a very basic level of doctors working together, very basic development of, if there's an office of research and development of Microsoft, let's say, or Apple or Google, they can come and set up a same shop, if not share those work in your country. This basic commercial research and R&D can be established, and you can be a part of this global network of R&D, research and development. These things need to be considered in the factor of this. When I hear, I'll just pause here. So those are my two major points, that the recognition and movement has, one, said that we will have a realist approach in these relationships, but it's also shed light of those who will not and cannot move ahead in diplomatic relations, are in fact being left out of this sort of progression of this global network of alliances. And so I think, and it's there's no name, no title, but it is a great deal of advances on almost every level, from sciences to construction to development to every level. And I think this is where the UAE and Bahrain realized that they needed to move this further. And thirdly, I think what's important is students of IR need to move beyond. Well, I'll pause and rephrase. I'm trying to rephrase this that will be politically correct. IR does not, international relations does not discount the suffering of anyone or any country, whether it be famine, caused by natural disasters, or caused by other countries' invasions or conflict, or caused by financial markets. IR is very much impacted by this. The field is very much impacted by the global pandemic and even the public health issues. However, to stand and position the sole existence, a sole issue, one issue, let's say the Palestinian issue, as the center of your international relations, diplomatic policy with another nation or other nations, it seems to, at one point or another, has not worked for 70 plus years, or it's not logical in the world of IR with where there are multiple issues and relationships and multiple levels and layers, multi-layers of relationships between the national sovereignty of one nation with another country, right? So there's so many multi-layers that a country is involved in when they cooperate with each other, of course, recognize and cooperate, collaborate, but these alliances bring an enormous amount of richness of we all know, to each other's development and mutual development, if that is indeed what we're agreeing on. So I would say what we expect next is not to just what will these countries gain from their recognition, but what we should also expect is what those countries who are not involved in the recognition of this peace deal, what will they lose as the time will go by? What will they lose in their own isolation? What will they lose in old thinking of the late 40s and 50s? They will also lose in the sense that one thinks that you're defending a cause, but the cause itself is not one-dimensional. It is very complex, and I'm not sure why Pakistan needs to throw itself on the sword to defend a cause that is a lot more complex, and it doesn't even neighbor these issues. I think there's a lot more benefits in the recognition and moving forward with these alliances. I will stop here, and I will hope to pursue and answer any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kamrul Huda. Dr. Kamrul Huda was our last speaker of the session. Now, moving towards Q&A session, I would first of all request Professor Zakiullah, Department of Pharmacy, University of Peshawar, to ask his question. Sir Zakiullah, please.
Assalamu alaikum, madam.
Walaikum assalam.
Madam, I have a question for Dr. Muqtadir. That although there is a talk of Israeli acceptance for Arab and Muslim world at large, but what and where is the role of international community? And based on international law, is Israel a legitimate state?
Well, it's an interesting question. You have asked two questions. One is about Israeli legitimacy, and the other one is the role of the international community. So the first question, yes, it is as legitimate a state as any other state, because legitimacy to the states comes from the United Nations. It is a member of the United Nations. The United Nations has 4 criteria for states to be recognized: that they have recognized borders, and they have populations, they can govern, and they can maintain international relations. And Israel has done a lot of that. There are very few countries in the world who do not recognize Israel as a state, and so in that case, whether the Muslim world accepts it or not, Israel is a recognized state. The question of legitimacy comes from international memberships, and Israel has that. As far as the international society is concerned, I mean, it is quite possible that Muslim countries are now going to abandon the Palestinian cause. And if you look at the Uyghur case, it will give you an idea. There are hardly any countries in the Muslim world who are advocating for the Uyghurs. Some Muslim countries have amnesia as if nothing is happening in China. So especially Pakistan, for example, the Pakistani Prime Minister pretends as if nothing is happening in China. And the Arab countries are going to pretend as if nothing is happening in West Bank and Gaza in the near future. However, you see the international community is very strongly advocating for the Uyghur cause. You can see with the protests against the new Disney movie, etc. So in that sense, you will see international activism going on, especially in Europe. I think the activism for the Palestinian state will move from the Arab world towards the West. You will see more activism for Palestinian rights from American Jews and young Americans. The BDS movement is gaining ground in Europe and the United States. So while I think the Muslim world will be more concerned about its own security issues, giving lip service to the Palestinian problem. To give you one example, one of the countries that has exploited the Palestinian cause to a great extent has been Turkey. And during the same period, Turkey also continued to increase its trade relations, exports and imports with Israel. So if Turkey was really serious about pushing the Palestinian cause, then it could have had, it could break diplomatic relations with Israel and end trade relations and put economic pressures. But they never did that. So I'm not very hopeful that Muslim countries will do much for Palestinian cause. But I do expect the international community to take it up, especially given the power of social media and international collaborations at the moment.
Dr. Minhas, please unmute.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Dr. Muqtadir Khan. Professor Zaki, I'm sure your question has been answered. Now there's a question from Tanveer Ahmed, MPhil Scholar, Department of Physics, and followed by Asif Bilal. Over to you, Tanveer Ahmed. Are you with us, Tanveer Ahmed? Okay, Asif, are you there? I think they have lost connection. Anyone who would like to ask a question from any of the speaker? Please unmute your mic and ask the question.
Professor Minhas, I think I saw Bilal's question. It was about Iran. If you,
okay, yes,
I can address that.
Sure.
Before I do that, I do want to recognize some friends here. Professor Ijaz Khan, Assalamu alaikum, sir, and General Asad Durrani is perhaps also online. So I just wanted to recognize them as guests. So to answer your question, Asif, on Iran, again, let's do empathetic analysis, exactly what I did with Israel. Let's use the same model on Iran. So the Iranian situation is that this is a historic moment for Iran as well. And when I mean the moment, I don't mean right now, I mean the last couple of decades. It's been 500 years at least since any Iranian state has been able to project power in the region. And the Iranians are very well aware of it. They have gained influence all along their western flank, running from Iraq through Syria to the Mediterranean via Lebanon. And they're also now pushing in the backyard of Saudi Arabia along the Red Sea area through the Houthis. So this is a very, if you will, advantageous position for the Iranians, one that they don't want to lose. Because, as I said, you don't gain this kind of influence. It takes centuries for states to have this kind of influence. States contract and expand over a very long period of time. They're not going to go quietly into the night. The Iranians can be expected to essentially hold their ground in Syria. And they face a lot of pressure financially from the United States and other Western powers because of the sanctions. But there is an opportunity from the Iranian point of view to take advantage of what I just mentioned earlier as the hollowing out of the Arab world. There's a vacuum being created. We saw ISIS emerge out of the vacuum. My colleague, Professor Muqtadir, mentioned how Turkey is pushing into this vacuum. But the Iranians have been there. And what is interesting about the Iranians is that for the first time ever in the history, for at least, let's say, 500 years, 5 centuries, you have a situation where an Iranian state is in control or has influence, disproportionate amount of influence of both the Mesopotamia, meaning Iraq, and the Levant, Lebanon and Syria. And they are blocking the Turks. If you go back in history, It was the other way around under the Ottomans. The Ottomans were the ones blocking the Iranians, who were then called the Safavid Empire in the 1500s, and the battle space ended along the line running from Tabriz through, eastern Iraq all the way down to Basra. So that was the sort of the containment line of the Ottomans. The Iranians have broken through that, and it's taken them 500 years. They are now blocking the Turks. The Turks need to punch through the Iranian lines in Syria and Iraq, and this is going to be difficult. It's going to take time. The Turks do not have the firepower right now, and the Iranians have had a head start. So if you look at this reality from an Iranian point of view has nothing to do with Israel. The Iranians are not capable of fighting the Israelis, and likewise, Israel is 1,200 miles away from Iran. Airstrikes can be conducted, but that's about it. And even airstrikes, if you have an air force the size of Israel, you think many times before you give the decision to do airstrikes on Iran, because you can lose your aircraft. And this isn't the United States with hundreds of aircraft that you can afford to lose. So this isn't a situation where the Israelis are going to go and push on the Iranians, and the Iranians are not interested in picking a fight with the Israelis. Don't bother yourself with rhetoric. Rhetoric is designed for public relations. It tells you nothing, really. You really have to, you could keep going all day long on statements and doing, discursive analysis about what leader is saying what. That's just PR. The reality is one of capabilities, and therefore you have to look at it from a strategic point of view, and of course, the tactical level reality. Now, what are the Israelis doing against the Iranians? Like I said earlier, they don't want the Iranians to have a foothold in Syria and Lebanon at the same time. But the Iranians need Syria. Why? Because if they lose Syria, they are disconnected from Hezbollah, from Lebanon, and their position in Iraq becomes vulnerable, because if you look at the demographics on the Syrian-Iraqi border, from Western Iraq through Eastern Syria, you have a Sunni majority population that represents a threat to any Shia regime in Baghdad and south of Baghdad. The Iranians themselves are secure, but it's their flank that they're worried about. And so this is what the Iranian deal is. The Iranians can wait for the Houthis to mature. They're not in a rush. They know that they've gone as far as they could, and they can't do anything more than have those occasional missiles being fired onto Saudi Arabia via drones or the conventional rockets. But that's about it. Their interest is in consolidating a contiguous sphere of influence running from Tehran. In fact, I would extend it to Herat. From Herat, even I would go all the way deeper into Afghanistan, through Iran, all the way to the Mediterranean. This is what they're trying to protect. The Arabian Peninsula is probably I don't think they are in a position to threaten that, and so they're not interested. And this is where they're coming into conflict. It's in the Levant where they're coming into conflict with Israeli interests.
Dr. Minhas, please unmute your mic.
I think we all have, sorry for that. The next question, thank you, Dr. Kamran, for your answer. The next question is by Visal Ahmed, MPhil scholar. Visal Ahmed, are you with us, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Please unmute your mic, Visal.
Okay, then. Good evening, everyone. My question is from all the speaker, everyone can answer. the recognition of this Jewish occupied Palestine as it is its right for the world by Pakistan, if Pakistan accept this, will maintain the morality of Pakistani ideology inside the country, and what will be the impact of this recognition on Pakistani society, especially the youth who grown up with the sayings of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who prevent us from this recognition.
Can I give a quick response to that, Professor Minas? Because he has also typed his question in the chat,
Yes, sir.
so you can read the question.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, please.
So he's basically asking what will happen to the morality of Pakistani ideology if Pakistan were to recognize Israel. It reminds me of that sher, "Ye na thi hamari qismat ke wisale yaar hota." So this Pakistan and Israel are two states, which are the only two states which can be considered as twins. These are the only two states in the modern era which are born of religious nationalism. Pakistan was a state created for Muslims as a nation, and Israel was a state created for Jews as a nation. So in that sense, it's ironic that these two countries do not have good relations. I once had dinner with General Musharraf, and he said something very interesting. He says, we have fought so many wars with India, but we have diplomatic relations with India. We have not fought any war with Israel, and we do not have any diplomatic relations with Israel. It does not make sense at all. However, there is a lot of, I think there is a need for the Pakistani society to question some of the prejudicial values that masquerade in the society as Islam. So hostility towards Jews. They need to be able to separate their anti-Semitism from their criticism of Israel as a state and its foreign policy. The same would also go with respect to their sentiments towards Hinduism and India. So I have a feeling that if the Pakistani society were to have an open dialogue on the rationality, the pros and cons of benefits, then I think they will realize that perhaps Pakistan will be able to influence Israel and help the Palestinians more by having a positive relation with Israel, or at least having diplomatic relations with Israel rather than ignoring it. And I think so, and I don't think that Pakistan's dilemma will come when Saudi Arabia recognizes Israel. And if Saudi Arabia recognizes Israel, then Pakistan will look as if it remains, subordinate to Saudi interests. So if Pakistan is going to take this step, I think it should take it before Saudi Arabia does. Otherwise, it will look as if it is following the lead of the Saudis. And I'll stop with
that. Thank you, Professor Khan. Now, there's another question for Dr. Kamrul Huda from Amina Fahad Majid Marbat. Amina, can you hear me?
Assalamu alaikum, ma'am. Yes, my question was, what is the role of religion in a state's recognition or future recognition of Israel? And also considering our volatile relationship with religion in Pakistan, how would it fare if a leader were to come about and say that Pakistan should perhaps consider diplomatic relations with Israel and recognize Israel as a state? Thank you.
Dr. Kamrul Huda, please unmute your mic.
Yeah, thank you. Because we're dealing with societies where religion plays an critically important role in identity and identity politics, as well as regional politics and others, it's also served as a uniting force as well as a divisive force. So we have to admit that the role of religion is far more as an active factor in any move or any decision to move forward with peace or and bilaterally or multilaterally. But I think what needs to be considered is, it's hard. one needs to have internal sort of within the policy lines and debates and discussions of how religion can be coexist and flourish, if not in doing this coexistence of various diplomatic relations. I mean, a religion is not something stagnant. Something is not just a one-dimensional, right? So the religion that or the religious role in the public spaces in 1947 to 1950s is far more different than what it is in the 2020 and so forth. And that's because of its sort of the way it's been nurtured, the way it's been allowed to be more involved, the way it's been entered in politics, and the way it's also been interpreted and so forth in local politics and in the regional politics. So in this, but I do not think in this that while it is a factor in the calculus of the international relations, it's one of many determinants, right? It's one of many things to decide and understand the way forward, and it should not be, in my perspective, a hindrance. And I think actually you would see Pakistani religious leaders around the globe and around everywhere, and when you do see Pakistanis, let's say in the U.S. or in China, or you see them in Africa, there are Israelis there. And the Pakistani leaders and religious leaders do not have problems in having Jewish, Muslim, Christian dialogues and so forth. I mean, we saw the minister of religious affairs actually in multi-faith, in promoting multi-faith. And Pakistan has a multi-faith community. It's built on multi-faith and recognizing that the multiple of faiths in Pakistan is its diversity and its strength. So this is the aspects that I think Pakistan society can nurture in its IR calculus and thinking moving forward. But there are stringent and rigid factions within Pakistan, and I don't think that they should be beholden to them. Instead, they should be trying to, if they cannot change their positions, they'll be like any society, they may or may not have a voice as Pakistan moves forward in thinking of its own national interest and national alliances. So yes, the role of religion is critically important. It has to be factored in, but I don't think it should be thought of as a way of an obstacle or a challenge to moving forward.
Dr. Minhas, please unmute your mic and then.
Thank you, Dr. Kamral Huda. Any question from the audience?
Yes, ma'am. I have a small question. It's Sumaya.
Yes, Sumaya Mukhtar, our MPhil student.
Madam, a lot of yes, sure. I'm sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, a lot of people associate the Palestine issue with Kashmir issue, and a lot of people in Pakistan, at least with whom I have conversed so far, think that if we recognize Israel as a legitimate state under international law, then it somehow shows hypocrisy on our side. And because we have fought 3 wars for Kashmir, and we have fought on all international and regional forums for Kashmiri cause, so does it really affect our stance regarding Kashmir if we go for recognizing Israel in the first place? Thank you.
Can I take that question? Just very briefly.
Brigadier.
Sure.
Janjiva, would you like to answer the question?
Thank you, Dr. Minhas. Interesting question. Interesting question, and I think in my speech also I think referred to this case. Yes, the circumstances are the same. In fact, I would go on to this thing. India existed for the last about 5,500 years, and there was no Israel for the last 2,000 years. So Israel just, as I said, I think I made an oblique reference that they were thinking to go to Argentina to have an Israel there, or to Africa. So probably the people who were the decision makers, they decided that they should come to this place where they are right now. So there is a difference between India and Pakistan were one state till 1947, and if the Kashmir is solved and others are taken out, I think India and Pakistan can be very good neighbors. And that was the aim of the founding fathers on the both sides. I have no doubt in that. Qaid said so. The reason is, but the situation of Palestine and Kashmir is absolutely same. They are the oppressed people. I have heard the doctors saying this thing. IR overriding the morality or the principles. Yes, IR is the consideration. And I also see where one of the gentlemen said that Israelis come into action. I was there in the United States for the training. They were my course mates. They were very good. They wanted to have interaction with us. And they are coming into the Middle East. But the problem is we have a stance over Kashmir, and similar situation exists in Palestine. Arabs, India even did not recognize Palestine and Israel till 1992, from 1948 till 92, and then they made the decision. And but they did not have the Kashmir and Palestine situation. We have this situation, and probably, as I said, somebody brought out that we should the opinion are those hardcore people. It is very difficult. The dynamics here in the country are very difficult. Extremely difficult. There are two different opinions. There are people who would go to recognize Israel, but then there are people who will do everything to stop this. So we ought to have a consensus before we make the decision. And that decision is, as I said while I was talking, if Israelis are ready to give concession, if they are ready to follow the international rules, somebody asked international law. Yes, I agree, they are member of the international forums. But if there was no force behind them, if there was no superpower behind them, and as we have said that the Arabs are good for nothing and all those things, probably the situation would have been different. So let's be realistic. I agree with the gentlemen, all three gentlemen what said. I have learned a lot from them. But situation here in Pakistan, their home country is different, and they know this situation very well. They know this situation very well here, that we have elements who can go to any extreme, and probably they do not have access to all that what these gentlemen have, what they have said. So it would be difficult for any government, and more so for a fragile government which has just I think 5 or 4 members majority in the House. So let's wait and see if Israel and as he said, I agree to that, what he said. The gentleman said that now it is going to shift to the Europe and the America itself. If the America and Europe, they can prevail upon Israel, and they can, and if Israel, these Palestinians are given their due right to exist as human beings, then Pakistan should not have any problem in recognizing Israel. But as far as I am concerned, and most of the Pakistanis also probably think that way, that morality is one thing, principles are another thing, and international relations should be governed keeping in view the national objectives. US has its own national objectives, and they always follow those. Israel has its national objectives, and we too ought to analyze and follow our national objectives. And for the time being, as I said, Prime Minister was very categoric. He said so. It would take time to build this consensus in Pakistan. And till the time it is not there, we cannot do it at the cost of instability within the country. That is what I feel. I think General Asad Durrani wanted to say something. He is sending the messages on the. If you can give some time to him, he may be able to put some more light onto this.
Professor Minnis, can I just quickly add something in 30 seconds?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead and request Lieutenant General Asad Durrani to respond to the question. After you, sir, Professor Khan.
Sure. So the point that I wanted to make was that the analogy between Kashmir and the Palestinians is not very similar.
Hello.
However, if you do assume that the Kashmiri situation is like the Palestinian situation, then you must understand that Pakistan recognizes India. And if the Kashmir situation is like the Palestinian situation, then why can't you recognize Israel? So that is there is a logical flaw in this assumption that because the Palestinian situation is like the Kashmiris, we should not recognize Israel. But you recognize India, and so it's not a similar analogy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Lieutenant General Asad Durrani, sir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Minhas. Normally one wants to sit back incognito, listen to all the nice talks, but sometimes, the cover is blown up, and this time it was done by Kamran, my old friend. And when he talked about it, then I had to switch on my camera, I had to unmute because, for old time's sake, I must say a few things. And right now, when another colleague of mine, Makbul Hussain, also dared me. So let me just sum up whatever I have said probably in the first session. I gave my opinion. Essentially, it was against recognition, but that is not the important thing is that people have their opinion. They are entitled to it. They are very good arguments. What is, in my assessment, likely to be done by the state of Pakistan? Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we are going to recognize Israel anytime soon. And the reasons are, number one, there is no compulsion. There is a big problem. We have other problems, and at this time, we do not want to stoke other fires. That is just one of them. The second is perhaps also not too bad reason, and that is wherever we are placed. After all, strategically, we have placed ourselves in a certain group. It's not a former bloc, but the members like Iran, Turkey, Russia, China, Malaysia, some of them may have recognized Israel. They did it for their own reasons, but the ambience of this group is such that we will have a problem recognizing it right now and will give perhaps the wrong message. The last point is perhaps the most important one. It's not about good and bad, what is beneficial and what is not beneficial. In any case, I personally, since I am not in favor of a mercantile state, so I do not think those material benefits should count that much. But what counts more is the DNA of this country, Pakistan. Historically, regardless of where anything happened, whenever the Muslim minorities were oppressed, whether it was Chechnya or Bosnia or God knows where all, in Palestine and Kashmir, of course, are important. We sided with the oppressed. We may not have done very well in so many different fronts, but this seems to be somehow or other into the people, not the government. The governments, of course, are pragmatic. The governments take their decisions. The governments hedge. The governments also probably, if they have not done anything different, it's because of people. But the people's DNA, people's sentiment is such that we, under these circumstances, do not find it compelling. And the last point, because I think someone did, one of your guests did mention, if we recognize it after the Saudis, it will not happen. Regardless of when we will recognize, it would be quite clearly seen that we are doing it because our arms have been twisted either by the United States or by the Saudis. So that message or that argument to me does not gel, but essentially what my assessment is, no, we will not do it. In the past, we used to pass on the buck to OIC, let the OIC decide, and the OIC was not likely to decide anything. Nowadays, we will not even do that. We've seen what happened when we asked the OIC about Kashmir. For Israel, we will not give this, we will not give them the mandate to decide on our behalf, because the OIC is right now in the pocket. It used to be in the pocket of the Saudis. Now it's an Israeli, instrument. So that is what I wanted to say. Naman, good to see you. All the best.
Thank you very much, sir. I see many questions coming in, but since we are short of time, knowing that our participants have other commitments and have busy schedules. Now, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to all the participants, and I believe that since you all made this conference webinar more interesting and engaging, I hope all of the audience have learned from it and enjoyed your speeches, your lectures, not only of the third session, but also the first and the second session as well, because most of the participants I see are attending all the sessions of this webinar. And I hope all the participants would have, particularly the speakers, would have enjoyed the discussion as much as the audience might have enjoyed it. Thank you again, all of you. And special thanks goes to Professor Dr. Muqtadir Khan, Dr. Kamran Bukhari, Dr. Kamrul Huda, Brigadier Akhtar Janjua, our participants from Turkey, Dr. Mustafa Kukak, Tunisia, Dr. Fatih Burmashi, from Balochistan, Professor Dr. Abdul Qadir, our students, faculty of University of Peshawar, and many of my Twitter followers who have joined almost all the sessions. I would like to thank all of them. And in the end, I would especially like to thank Dr. Saima and Dr. Khurshid. Dr. Khurshid was coordinator of the conference, the webinar, and Dr. Saima also was a great support in arranging this webinar. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And with this, I would like to say Khuda Hafiz to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Have a nice day.
Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you, Dr. Minhas.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All the best.